and dandy.
I showed her how to dangle.
To the dangers that we have spoken about so many times.
I'm Lieutenant Dan Taylor. Welcome to Fort Platoon.
Lieutenant Dan sure knew his stuff. Lieutenant Dan was always getting these funny feelings about Iraq.
Strong arm, I know my position is danger close. Over.
Check strong arm, wait one for flash.
Lieutenant Dan, calm us down! Lieutenant Dan, I got you some ice cream. Lieutenant Dan, ice cream. Even Lieutenant Dan would come and watch me play.
I was Lieutenant Dan Taylor.
You still Lieutenant Dan.
Guess what, Lieutenant Dan? They want to give me a ma'am. What'd they do with Lieutenant Dan? Now that's Lieutenant Dan. Lieutenant Dan! Lieutenant Dan! Lieutenant Dan said he was living in a hotel. Hey, what do you do here in New York, Lieutenant Dan? I stayed with Lieutenant Dan and celebrated the holidays. I'm going to heaven, Lieutenant Dan. A promise is a promise, Lieutenant Dan.
What are you complaining about?
I'm sorry I ruined your New Year's Eve party, Lieutenant Dan. I guess Lieutenant Dan figured... Lieutenant Dan! What are you doing here? Well, you ain't got no legs, Lieutenant Dan. Still no shrimp, Lieutenant Dan.
Okay, so I was wrong.
Sometimes Lieutenant Dan came too. It's funny Lieutenant Dan said that, because right then, God showed up. But Lieutenant Dan, he was mad. Would you like to see what Lieutenant Dan looks like? And let me tell you something about Lieutenant Dan. So I never went back to work for Lieutenant Dan. And even though Bubba was dead, and Lieutenant Dan said I was nuts, and she even showed me how to dance, I'd think a lot about Mama and Bubba and Lieutenant Dan. Lieutenant Dan. Lieutenant Dan. Lieutenant Dan.
Hi, Forrest.
Lieutenant Dan. This is my Jenny. It's Lieutenant Dan.